what I want to do today is go over how to do a marathon the right way. I don't think anyone else is coming, so we're just going to get started. Cool. I do want this, you guys can ask questions at any point, although at the end I will reserve time for basically a Q&A. So you can decide, either cut me off, just raise your hand. I'll repeat the question just so my phone gets it. But from there, we're ready to get started. Most of you guys either have a marathon in the works or said, I know you want to do a half marathon one day. So the principles that we talk about basically cover anything past a 10K. The shorter distances have some different variables that you want to factor in, but come on, Lynn. No, you're good. Different variables, but for these mid-distance, basically half marathon, marathon, and then roughly up to a 50K, the principles stay the same. So today's objective, I want you to leave more confident with your run plan, your training and race day nutrition, and then strength training that you'll do leading into the race. So the 3 pillars, this goes for your strength training, but definitely what we're talking about covering on your marathon plan will be your intensity. So most of you know that as your pace. We'll get into the differences in what that might be, but your pace, volume, so weekly mileage, and then frequency. How frequent are you going to run in the week? Those are the 3 things that we would build a plan around. So how hard should you train? That's what everybody wants to know. What is training intensity? So I have this graph here, and I'll talk about it in a second, but most of us know it as zone-based training. So we've got your heart rate. We can use the talk test, so your breath being measured, and then lactate threshold. You're going to see these terms all over the place. People tell you go based on your lactate threshold, which means how much lactate you have in your bloodstream, how hard it is to breathe, and then heart rate. But we also have RPE-based training, so a scale of 1 to 10. Originally, there was a scientist named Borg who would give people, he would say, how hard is this? He did it on a bike. How hard is this cycling based on 6 to 20? The reason he did that is he would ask, Michael, how hard is this? And you might respond, it's like an 8 out of 20. That would correlate to an 80 beats per minute, for almost everybody. We can scale that down, so you guys who have come to my classes, you hear me say zone 2 should be like a 5 out of 10 difficulty. So when we talk about how hard you should train, we want to make sure that you understand your performance isn't always linear. Not every hard day you're going to hit the same paces. We live here in Texas. The weather is just crazy. Sometimes when it's really hot out, you're going to go much slower, 1 to 2 minutes slower than if the temperature was 60 degrees cooler. That's possible within a couple of months. Because right now, you training outside, it might hit 100 over the next couple of days. The race you're training for, Kyle, in December is gonna be, it could be anywhere from 40 to 60 degrees that day. So just know that, that's why pace in zones, I'm not a huge fan of, because most of you guys are training for outdoor races. Your heart rate can be influenced by things like how much caffeine, how much sleep you got. If you're very tired, some people's heart rate goes really low. Some people, you get wired and your heart rate goes high. So if you probably use your watch. Those of you who come to my classes, I don't rely on that all too often because your heart rate is dependent on so many things. For example, if you have a long run and it's supposed to be a zone 2 run, right? There's something called cardiac drift. As you go longer into that run, it might feel the same, but as you lose volume in your blood from sweating, water's coming out of it, your heart has to pump faster because it has less coming into it, so your heart rate becomes less reliable. So those are big, big factors that you want to play. Now, that doesn't mean they're not useful. So what this graph is, it seems overwhelming. In the research, what they have found is 2 distinct points called VT1 and VT2. That's really, what they stand for is ventilatory threshold, meaning ventilatory being your breath, threshold being when something changes. Now you can see this line here, and this line here. Now, in my classes, I say recovery and zone 1 are not the same thing. Now I know some people might tell you otherwise. That's a big, big difference. So you can see this would be correlated with zone 1, zone 2, zone 3, zone 4, and zone 5. Okay? Now, in research or the things, your plans, a lot of times VO2 max is talked about. We'll get to that in a second. But just know that there are clear differences to what you're experiencing at different zones. Now, subjectively, let's talk about that. In like the beginning phases of your warm-up, you're basically feeling like you can breathe normally, okay? Zone 1, there's a slight change, but not that much different. But you do have to work in order to get out of zone 0 into zone 1. Recovery and zone 1 are two distinct phases, okay? Zone 2, this is the magic zone, and we'll get to like the benefits of zone 2 later. This is what VT1 is, when literally your breath changes. So although it is conversation pace, that's what we call it, there is some labor in your breathing. Zone 3 is when it gets uncomfortable. This is actually where most people default to when they run, and there's a lot of problems with that. We'll come back to that. But zone 3, you get a lot of that in our classes. Zone 3, there is advantages, but that's going to be the difference between, there is like small change between VT1, VT2, and VT2 is zone 4. Zone 4 days are really hard. That's what you guys just went through. Zone 4 is very difficult to sustain. So if you can hold zone 4 for 5 minutes, it's most likely not zone 4 on the cellular level, because if you can talk during it, it's not technically zone 4, because what VT2 is by definition is when your breath is so short, 3 to 5 words is really difficult. And then zone 5 is like, obviously, like I can't move anymore, it's all out. Think ultra fit, or very, very big bursts of energy that might last 15 to 30 seconds. So do we feel pretty good about different intensity zones? We'll get into how to use them in a second, but do you see the clear distinction between them? Now, going back to it, I'm really a fan of RPE-based training because of all the factors that can change what's going on in here. So going back to it, this should be like a 3 to 5 out of 10 difficulty, 5 out of 10, 7 out of 10, 8 out of 10, and then obviously your VO2 max being 10 out of 10. And then your VO2 max is going to be literally the volume of oxygen you can use per kilogram your body weighs. That's it. That's what that is. And the people who can train at a higher intensity, closer to their VO2 max, just tend to be faster. Or they're really freaking light, and that's why marathon world record holders tend to be 110 pounds, because they weigh less. All right, feel good about that? Different types of workouts based on intensity. I know I'm kind of going through this a little bit staggered, but you'll see what the sample week would look like based on that. I just felt really cute, so I wanted to put a bunny and a turtle, so we're gonna work our way this way. Okay, so interval workouts. This would be zone 4. Now, for a half marathon and a marathon, they're gonna be a little bit longer than what you guys might be used to in current classes. So typically, now everybody's a little bit differently, but typically they're a quarter mile, so 400 meters, all the way up to 1,600 meters or a mile. What you often see people do is 400 meter repeats, 800 meter repeats, 1,200 meter repeats, or 1 mile repeats. The advantage to these is that you're really increasing your peak speed over time. What people get wrong about half marathons and marathons is that being fast still matters. So the world record marathon would be a 4:38 pace for 2 hours straight. So if you put your treadmill at a 13.1 and just left it there for 2 hours, that's what the top people are running. So speed matters. What people often do, though, is they aren't trying to push themselves here hard enough. These things matter a lot. A fartlek is a Swedish word that just means speed play. So what that is, some people do longer runs where they intermix intervals. I'm not going to get to that, but just if you guys have heard that, just know that that is in this category, intervals. Now, what you want to do with intervals is you want to progress them. One way that you could really work them is, let's say you did, I'll give an example of 8 by 400 in your first block of training. So maybe 2 to 3 weeks you do 8 by 400. Then in the second block, if you want to get a little bit further, see if you can hold that same pace for 800 meters, you would just do 4 by 800. So the volume of intensity is the same, but how long you have to hold that pace is greater. So you can see what works for you, and then obviously that would be 2 by 1 mile by the end of that block, but in subsequent blocks. So that's typically how somebody could progress it. Or you could say, some people I have seen go with the longer distances in the beginning and then try to get faster, so maybe increase their peak speed as blocks progress. Now, a lot of people want to know what is the perfect type of interval workout. And some people just respond so differently. So it's so individual that I have to stress that you're just trying to use the principle of intensity to build out what works best for you. Because I've had some clients who respond very well to intensity, can get away with 2 or 3 intense workouts in a week. And I've seen people who progress really well when they do less frequent intensity sessions. So just know that, some people really like that quarter mile distance because they can turn it up, versus maybe they get beat up in that 1 mile distance, slows them down just enough, but it improves their VO2 max. So, you want to get variable in there, but that's the point. You do want to rest as much as you can, like as the session would allow, so maybe 2 to 5 minutes in between each interval. Yeah, all right. Threshold workouts. These are typically often overused, so threshold being that VT2, where it's hard to breathe, but you're not quite going all out. Now, 7 out of 10 difficulty, these really do push that VO2 max because you're kind of starving your body of oxygen for longer periods of time. They fall in that 5 to 15 minute efforts. So holding like that really uncomfortable pace for like 15 minutes. Now these tend to be less frequent, like you don't want to do this once a week because they are very, very, very fatiguing. Yeah, could you imagine holding like a 7 to 10 out of 10 difficulty for 15 minutes? And some people do, like right now, it's really popular for the Norwegian team. They do double threshold workout days. So they do some in the morning and then some in the evening on the same day. Just because they're so fatiguing, they don't want to spread it out. But it can be pretty tough on the body. Some people may need these. If you feel like you don't have as much mental toughness, that can be a good way to see if you can push through for long periods of time. That tends not to be a good reason to do it all that often, but it can be in there. Threshold really pushes that VO2 max, but you don't need it all that often because it can be just so fatiguing. Now we've got tempo workouts. These aren't too dissimilar, but this is basically like kind of the same thing. You're just going a little bit easier. So it is uncomfortable, what we call zone 3, that uncomfortable pace, but you're not feeling like you're gonna die during the run. So that's where we're gonna be marathon practice is what I would say. Because most of the time your tempo runs are gonna be no longer than an hour. And unless you guys are a marathon record holder, I'm assuming you're gonna be in that 3.5 to 5 hour range. So, this is just practicing those tempo speeds. And then your long, slow run is gonna be 30 to 180 minute efforts. Now, they can go even longer. The evidence shows that there's not much benefit after 2.5 hours. I like time-based training, but distance-based training works as well. Often when people take like an elite marathoner and they go, oh, they did a 20-mile workout on a Saturday. Remember, that's only taking them 2 hours, So our bodies respond to intensity at certain times. Distance can be really tricky if you're running a 10-minute pace for 20 miles. That can take a really long time. And there are benefits to the psychological, learning how to go for that long, learning how to eat for that long over 2.5 hours. But physiologically, anatomically speaking, 2.5 hours seems to be about where most people would get the most benefit from. But for most of training, I would say like 3 hours is good, but 2.5, 2 hours is probably where we want to fall. This should be zone 2, 3 to 6 RPE. A lot of people mess this up where their zone 2 days tend to be a little too hard. A lot of fatigue, if this is too hard, really interferes with this. And then you kind of get into this cycle where all of your training looks about the same. You feel beat up all the time. And this is where people say marathon training takes over their life and they can't do anything, because they try to intermingle all these things rather than make them very separate from each other. This builds aerobic capacity with little fatigue if done correctly. And then it should just really be easy work. This is the conversation pace. If you were to run with somebody, you should be able to talk to them the whole time. Cool? Any questions? Yeah.
So on the interval training stuff, is it good to use like a track so you know the distance, but does the actual track surface not give you any real life?
That's a great question. So I have found, I think it really depends on what you're trying to use the track workout for. So the question is it good to do your interval work on the track? Because then you would know what distances to do. If it's 400 meters, you just do one lap. Or is it better to practice on the road where similar conditions? I don't want to just rely on this. It depends. Dallas, this half and full, it's relatively flat for the whole thing. So I think somebody could absolutely get away with doing 400-meter repeats on the track where you're just really going for speed. Maybe if you're really far out from a very hilly race, let's just say my client, she did, I think it was Jasper, Wyoming marathon. Obviously, there's going to be a little bit more terrain there. Even Fort Worth, that marathon has a little more terrain. Probably be better to do that outside and getting some hills in there. Mountain marathons, you're going to want to do them on the treadmill to get some, speed climbing. So I would say you want to match it as close as possible, or if you're so far out and you're really just trying to increase peak speed, that's where a track would be most useful. To actually practice like the kick you might need during a race, you want to match it as close to the terrain you're going to race on. Yep. Okay. How much should you be running? This tends to be the question most people are wanting to ask, but they don't know how to ask it. I would say I'm probably a little more iconoclast with it than most, because if you look at a plan, it's going to progress you, right? That's what everybody thinks. It's like, okay, well, I'm going to start with a 3-mile run, a 5-mile run, and then a 7-mile run on the weekend, and then I eventually have to get to a 23-mile run before I do a 26.2. That's logical. That makes sense. But we already talked about time-based versus distance. I'm a fan of the time versus distance. One, conditions. If you're slower, 6 miles on a hot day is going to be different than 6 miles on a cool day, right? Because you can go faster and it might feel better. You might be beat up. So the difference between 5.5 miles and 6.5 miles really doesn't matter. And if you need to go slower because it's an easy day, and you're crunched on time, it's a little bit easier to square those circles. It's highly individualized. Elite marathoners are running like 120 miles a week. That's their life. Like that's all they do. Some of them may help children, but that is their job. They can do that. They aren't doing like manual labor outside of it. They have all of their life stressors might be surrounding this, right? So what impacts their recovery is very little. I have seen people, including myself, get away with 20 miles in a week. I would not recommend that. I'm just saying if you had to and you were time constraints, you can get away with training very little. What I would say is you want to focus on quality of your training versus just going based on how many miles in the week. More does not equal better. Most of us, if this is your first marathon, jumping into the deep end and just trying to hit 50, 60, 70 mile weeks could, not always, but it could end in disaster just because you might be ready for that type of training, but not all of you. Your ankles, your tendons, your bones, all are responding to this training as well. And you can push them over the edge before you're ready to be pushed over the edge. So just remember, you're trying to see how your body responds to training as you go along. There is a good rule of thumb that I do enjoy. Don't progress faster than 10% a week. So if you did 10, this is where it kind of gets hazy. But if you were to start with a 20-mile-a-week plan, you'd want to do 22, then 25, basically there. Where it gets kind of murky is if you go from 10 miles a week, you're not going to want to go to 11, then 12. You're going to want to go a little bit faster. But for most of us, going from 50 to 55 is a big jump. 55 to 60, still okay. You don't want to go from 50, 60, 70, 80. That's where people get really, really, really in deep trouble when they try to get those high miles because they're just trying to get more. And then the long run is probably the thing people talk about the most on the weekends, right? I need to get in that 20-mile run. So I've got some examples here. So it's definitely important to learn how to go for that long. But remember, the marathon is a test of your aerobic capacity and how long you can hold like that VT2 threshold, right? That is the test of the marathon. But so much goes into that. And you're not getting it just from doing 20 miles on the weekend or 23 miles on the weekend. What you do throughout the week also matters. So I did use an example. Some people might respond to this better, but if you had to get, let's just say that week you couldn't get your 20-mile run in, but you knew you had 50 miles to distribute throughout the week in various intensity zones. It's better to do the 5 by 10 than less and just trying to squeeze in a big 20-mile run or missing it. That we're building aerobic capacity over all of our workouts. So if you know that like 20 miles is just really messing you up trying to get that every week, your recovery is poor, it just seems to set you back for those other workouts, it's better to shorten that one than to extend it. Now, on the other hand, you really do want to get those long runs in, 3 hours, getting that practice in. That's a really, really good thing to do. But there's no required distance before the race. Because remember, if 26.2 is your PR, that's the first time you've ever done that long of a distance, which means you don't have to go that far before you do it. Some people get away with 16 miles before they get into their race. You want to focus on the quality of your workouts, the quality of those runs, before you're just quantifying the distance all the time. And going back to it, 2.5 hours. That's where it's good. Some people it might be 2 hours, some people it might be 3. But I would say if you needed to get in 1 4-hour run because you just wanted to see what it was like to eat during the race or during practicing and all that, that would be the advantage. Do I have any questions there? No? Okay. Just wanted to throw in a sample week. I just made this up. This was a fictitious athlete just so you guys can see how it might fall in if somebody were to. So going back to those 3 pillars, going based on intensity. So we have interval days here. So these would be zone 4 intervals, zone 4, zone 5. This would be like zone 3, that tempo run. Zone 2, now I know these are the same lines, but this would be the equivalent to that. It's just how it's based in there. So these easy runs would be zone 2, and then your long run going with a zone 2 and then finishing with 30 minutes of zone 3. 6 days in the week, that would be the frequency, right? And then 1 recovery day just to have the day off, okay? I just did this as time-based, so you got an hour and a half run, 1 hour, 1 hour, 1 hour, and then basically an hour on the other 2. You can also see how I intermixed, these are zone 3s here. You don't, just because I put that as a workout, the idea of zone 3 being intermixed with other things is a part of that too. And that's where you guys have seen in our classes where we might do zone 2, zone 3 repeats, where you're trying to get that flow in there. So this would be zone 2 for the first hour, and then the last third being zone 3, where you're practicing that marathon, right? We talked about how zone 3 is practicing marathon, seeing how it feels to hold that pace at the end of your first hour, and you might progress that over time. You might make this a little bit longer, or if somebody's starting with 4 days of running in the week, they might add an additional 30 minutes on another day, and then build from there. Any questions? Because this is going to conclude my running part of the training before we go on to nutrition. No? We're good? Okay. Either that's a really good sign or a really bad sign. Okay, so obviously nutrition is very important for most of us coming from either a start-stop program, a type of sport, or a bodybuilding background. A lot of that nutrition advice does not apply here. It's much different than what we tend to see on like TikTok for weight loss and all that fun stuff. So we'll go over race day nutrition, training nutrition, so before, during, and after, and then lifestyle nutrition factors. All right, so we're gonna work our way back from the race. So race day, you wake up. So just know during the race, 60 to 90 grams of carbohydrates per hour. For some of you, that might be more carbs than you try to eat in an entire day, but we want to eat that every single hour. So depending on if you take gels and liquid calories, that tends to be what is either on course that day or what most people try to train with. I really am a big fan of gels and liquid nutrition, just because if you're going to be going for that hard for that long, it can be really uncomfortable to try and eat real food, as you could imagine. But for some of us, like, real food might be the only option if we're going 5+ hours and you really are hungry, because that can happen if you need to walk during the race. And for those of you going to your first half or full, there's a lot of people walking, so you're going to need a lot of calories during that period of time more than anything. But 60 to 90 grams of carbohydrates per hour. That might be 3 to 5 gels an hour if that's how you're taking it in. And that can be shocking to a lot of you, and that can cause like diarrhea for a lot of you too if you're not practicing. So my point, working our way back, you can actually train your gut to handle more carbohydrates over time. I remember when I first started, I did a liquid nutrition, and it came out as liquid nutrition. Now that I've been doing this for a long time, my stomach handles like pure sugar very, very well. Some people eat candy. That can fall in there too. You want to go as simple as possible during this without a lot of GI upset, and we can talk about how we can get in there. But to some degree, when you're racing something at that intensity, sometimes it's just hard to get around nausea and diarrhea. You might find why they put liners in race shorts. But that is why they put that in there. Christina and I threw that joke in for her. That is not why, but just know that it can cause some GI upset if you're not practicing with that. So what I would recommend is find what works for you. Don't do anything new on race day. Like, you should have already practiced what you're going to go into that race with. Hydration, fluid to thirst. You want to sip on things. You don't want to be chugging a lot during the race. You don't want to go long periods of time, get to a water station, try to take 3 cups in, because that's just going to be a lot of sloshing. Talking about sloshing, you want to use 400 to 1,500 milligrams per liter of sodium. This is where it might get a little crazy. 60 to 90 grams per hour. But when we're talking about sodium, electrolytes, what you guys know, it is based on how much fluid you're taking in, not by time, okay? Because if we get too low on sodium, you can get this sloshing feeling, you get nausea, it can be really uncomfortable, you feel yourself swelling up. You gotta make sure you're taking in enough sodium. And it's based on how much fluid you take, because that's what pulls water inside your body, is sodium, potassium, all the electrolytes. So make sure some people are 400 milligrams per liter, and then some of us are on the 1,500 up to 2,000 milligrams per liter. It really is really based on what you feel throughout the race. You should be practicing with these things as you go in. I would say before the race, the reason for coffee is you're trying to stimulate poop. You want to get that out before the race. Coffee, even decaf, can help stimulate that. I would say 1.5 to 2 hours beforehand. You want to make sure that you're using caffeine wisely. Some of us who like to take a lot of pre-workout just know that those jitters, like, there is a lot of excitement for most of these races. Everyone in here is either doing Dallas or a big race. There is a lot of excitement, so going higher with caffeine can really throw us into an amped up state. I would say if you're already drinking coffee in the morning, just extend that. But I would not do more the morning of the race. If you want to take caffeinated gels during the race, that's one thing to keep your energy high, but the energy is just so high in the beginning that you're already tempted to run fast as the race goes on. Don't. So don't drink more caffeine thinking, I need to freaking go. Coffee and then a normal meal. You want to have higher carbs. You're going to prioritize higher carbs during this meal, but you want to have some fat and some protein. The reason for the fat, it can slow down digestion a little bit, which is what we want, just so that we're not getting a lot of GI upset. Because could you imagine if you just took in like scoops of sugar? That would be very uncomfortable. That's why the 60 to 90 grams can be a lot. But if we just throw, an example would be like, the most common would be people who do bagels with peanut butter. right? A bagel with peanut butter has plenty of carbohydrates. It has a little bit of fat from the peanut, or decent amount of fat from the peanut butter and a decent amount of protein. And the protein is just, it's good for digestion, and then you're obviously going to be without protein for 3 to 6 hours, right? So it's good to get those amino acids in, but as well as that fat slowing down digestion, so things aren't just dumping out of your stomach and GI, causing you to have diarrhea in the long run. So it can really help with that. That's what people tend to eat, is like the bagel or English muffins with some peanut butter. I would recommend not having dairy if you've ever watched Anchorman, but some people like Greek yogurt 2 hours beforehand. But you want to have that last meal quite some time before. And then this is a big one. You don't want to have a giant carb load meal the night before. Reason being, yeah, exactly. Yeah, do not do it. Don't do it. It's a bad idea. Digestion occurs over 16 to 24 hours. So let's say the race, I believe, starts at 7 a.m. If you eat at 7 p.m. the night before, all of that stuff is still digesting 12 hours. Like, you are going to have to poop really hard and like a lot if you are still digesting that food during your race. Carb loading is a thing. Like, that is a real concept. But you don't want a big meal the night before, because that's still working inside of you. Okay? What you want to do, smart carb loading, is days beforehand. I say slightly higher, but for some of you that is insanely high. 600 to 700 grams of carbohydrates the week leading up to it. Yeah. Don't worry, all per day. But I would say that what you would want to do is, like, depending on how much you're running leading into the race, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, all high, and then you want to keep Friday as normal as it was before, because then all those carbohydrates are in your cells now, and they're not in your GI tract. Versus most people, they eat normal or they eat very little because they don't want to gain fat up until Thursday. Big meal on Friday, and now we've got to digest all of that going into Saturday or Sunday, whatever. So Dallas is on Sunday, so shift that. So Saturday you want as normal as possible. Wednesday, Thursday, Friday might be slightly higher, or for some of you, significantly higher. Really, you're not going to gain that much fat. You might gain half a pound of fat in reality during that, but guess what? You're going to burn thousands of calories during the race. I don't want you thinking that way. I'm not a proponent of earning your calories, but just know that you want to fill those muscle cells with as many carbohydrates as possible. So the concept is there. Practically speaking, you don't want to be digesting that food during your race. Does that make sense? Yeah. Because if it's 24 hours later, you're still working on that. So eat normal. So for some of us, that might be 250 to 350 grams of carbs. You still want to eat like a normal human being, but you don't want this giant meal the night before. Good on race day nutrition. You got to practice it, because we'll get into that. You got to practice it. Training nutrition. You got to practice it. The concepts stay the same. Even if you have a 1 hour run, you still want to practice 60 to 90 grams per hour. Yeah? Even if you got a 45-minute run, you might not do 60 grams in that hour, but you do 45 grams in that hour, right? You still got to practice it, because you're training your gut to withstand that many calories and carbohydrates while you're moving your body. And for some of you, the first time you try to eat something, you might choke, because breathing, running, and eating at the same time, it's like rubbing your belly and patting your head. Like, it's all over the place. All right, so before, same thing, 1 to 2 hours before, carbohydrate-rich meal, low fiber, so meaning you don't want to eat a lot of like vegetables, like leafy greens, probably aren't the most optimal, but if you're getting it in 2 hours before, you're just prioritizing lower fiber. And then lower fat, but not zero. So the concept would be the same. Bagel with peanut butter kind of falls into that. But if you ate like a sandwich or something, so I put stuff like this here. The concept is still getting some carbohydrates in to fuel your run. And then, because remember, you're probably not recovered completely from your training, because that's part of training, is that you're always slightly under recovered. So you want to eat carbohydrates to fuel that next performance. During 60 to 90 grams of carbs per hour. Fluid to taste. Your sweat rate is different, but we've talked about that. 400 to 1,500 milligrams of sodium per liter of fluid. and then possibly amino acids. If you're doing like a 3-hour run, sometimes like Guroctane, they have amino acids in there. You might have your favorite brand of aminos that look like lemonade. If you can't get in a protein source for those 3 hours, that can really help with the recovery since you're breaking down for that amount of time. That's more for the long run. And then afterward, it's very similar to what your weight training nutrition might be. What people don't realize is that lifting weights, although people talk about it's breaking down your muscle, one, that's not true, but that's not why we're here today. Running is way more damaging to our bones, muscles, tendons than weight training ever could be, because it's just repeated over and over and over again. So I would say the protein requirements are just as equivalent to what we would expect from weight training, because like your bones need calcium to recover, they need amino acids to do their job. Your tendons are collagen fibers, so they need amino acids to do their job. So don't slack on your protein just because now you're an endurance athlete. It's just as important, if not, I'd probably say it's probably equivalent. And then a carbohydrate-rich meal. Now, I know I'm talking about carbs a lot. You can still gain fat on a marathon program. I did when I first started running. I gained like 10 pounds because I was like, oh, cool, like I'm training a lot. Really, I mean, you can outrun a bad diet, but that would require most of us to run about 25 to 30 miles a day, and I don't know anybody in here that's doing that. So just know that you still want to be mindful of what you're eating. Just know that carbs really we're trying to replenish our muscle glycogen so that we can have another good workout the next day. You don't always want to be starving yourself. You need to be training so that your training can be intense enough to get the adaptations you're looking for. So we feel good about the pre, intra, and post. Pretty self-explanatory. And then nutrition for the athlete, who you are as a person. So just know that roughly speaking, obviously there's so many factors at play here: terrain, temperature, body size, organ size, those things matter. But it's roughly 0.67 calories per mile you run. Giving you an example, I weigh about 180 pounds, so it'd be about 120 calories per mile I run. How fast you run actually does not play a role in how many calories you burn. And I would not look at your watch, because your watch doesn't know the equation well. You know, you guys just did, some of you guys just did Hybrid XT, probably said you burned 1,000 calories during that hour. I don't know, something ridiculous. That cannot be true. It's not. It's not. But if I ran 6 miles, I know I'm going to burn about 750 calories. Because the only thing that matters, there's two things, and I've been dying to say this in front of a camera. So, me being the good husband that I am, I'm still in my 2015 Honda Civic, and I bought my wife a 2022 Chevy Tahoe. What are the biggest differences in gas mileage between those two vehicles? Size. Literally, how big someone is determines how many calories they burn. That's it. Now, if my Tahoe sits in my driveway and it does no movement, and I'm whipping it around all crazy in my Civic, what's going to burn more gas? The Civic, because it's moving and one's not. So literally, humans are no different. How big you are and how far you go are the biggest determinants for how many calories you burn. It's simple as that. Don't complicate it, okay? People try to be like, oh man, push myself really hard and I'm really hungry, so that means I need more calories. No. Or, I didn't push myself that hard today, but I did 20 miles. I don't deserve that food. No, you need to eat, because guess what? Come Monday, you gotta turn it up again. Does that make sense? So we're clear on that. The real number is about 0.62, so 0.62 about to 0.73. Just use this number. Don't always use it as a math equation, because it's going to bite you in the ass if you try to do that. Body weight, resting metabolic rate. I like using this number, but know that there is an 800 calorie difference between some people on the low end and the high end. But for most people, it's about 10 times your body weight is what, if you laid down, stared at the ceiling, just went to the bathroom, all that, about 10 times your body weight. Okay, so me being 180 pounds, my resting metabolic rate is about 1,800 if I were just to do basically nothing, be a bum all day. Okay? Now, lifestyle factors. Every 5,000 steps, or excuse me, every 10,000 steps, I would add about 500 calories, but the concept is still the same. If you walked a mile or you ran a mile, you're still burning 0.67. It's just a little rule of thumb. Obviously, a lighter person walking 10,000 steps is much easier on their body. They burn less calories than somebody who would be much heavier. But about that. So how many steps throughout your day matters, right? That's going to be a big play. How much strength training are you doing? I think those are biggest things towards lifestyle factors that are going to influence how much you need to eat. Micronutrient needs increase for an athlete. You've worked with some pretty high-level athletes. Like, you've seen when people are eating a shit diet, they probably don't recover as well all the time. I mean, because most elite athletes eat like children. I've worked with them. They like McDonald's just like I do. But the big ones, especially for endurance athletes, because one, you're gonna be sweating things out, but two, you are destroying red blood cells at a much higher rate, which is a good thing. You want that so that your body is forced to make more. That's why Lance Armstrong got in trouble, because he was using EPO. But iron is gonna be a big one, because when you're flushing out those red blood cells, your iron goes with it. For men, we don't menstruate monthly. I don't know if you knew that, but make sure you're taking it easy. You should get blood work done before you start supplementing with iron, but we do get it in our food as well. Women, that becomes a much bigger factor because you are bleeding, and then now you have this big rush of iron going out of your system. Magnesium can be a big one. You want to get your blood work done. You can see this shit online where it's like, if you're not blank, 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 you are deficient in this thing. Go get your blood work done, talk to your doctor before you just start taking these big supplements. Because magnesium, people say it does help with sleep, it can be that, but there's so many things that can affect your sleep and your recovery. So magnesium is another one that you don't want to take too much of. Iron being the biggest, because you can have too much iron in your system. Magnesium can sometimes have those problems too. Vitamins B, D, C, and E, only one of them being a fat-soluble vitamin. Obviously, you're going through a lot of fluid. You're sweating it out. You're peeing a lot, right? You're drinking more water. So B, C, and E are big ones that you can, B and C being water-soluble, you're peeing them out. D and E, I don't know the exact why there's a higher turnover of D and E in the body, but to recover better and to have the other processes, I'm assuming the demands on those two vitamins in your body just become greater, so you need a greater amount than people who aren't as active. And then zinc and selenium, you sweat those out as well, and so we just need to replenish those as much as we can. Okay, strength training. The evidence is not so clear in the sense of like it preventing injuries, but I think we can all say, practically speaking, we've seen more durable athletes not get injured as often, right? So I wouldn't say it's a prescriptive, I would say it's more of a recommendation to continue strength training, since everybody in this room liked strength training already. It would just be a continuation of, right? I'm not convincing anyone to do more of it. What I would say is if you're already training 3 to 4 days a week, that should not slow down. So here's where a lot of the things go wrong though. You need to go heavy. Most people assume, well, now I'm doing an endurance program, I need more muscular endurance. Well, if I can back squat 500 pounds, how many times can I back squat 100 pounds? Just an insane amount. So the stronger we are, the more muscular endurance you inevitably have, right? That concept stays. So you should be trying to get your peak strength higher within reason, as long as it's not interfering with your goals for the marathon. So we should be strength training with something that's completely opposite of what you're doing all the time. What I see all too often, I'll just use this as an example. People will be training for a marathon, and now they start doing body weight lunges for 40. And it's like, are you fucking kidding me? Like, you're already doing so much of that when you're running. Why would you just perpetuate that to get more fatigue for none of the benefits? Right? You want the opposite. You want the opposite stimulus, super high intensity. Now, I say high intensity. I'm just talking about like really heavy on you, because that's the thing you're not doing. That's what you want to put your body through, something that's separate from what you're already doing so much of. Body weight is redundant. You're just getting a ton of fatigue with none of the reward. You want to go lower reps. Now I say low. That could be anywhere from 5 to 15, because when you think about it, during a marathon, you might quite literally hit 60,000 steps. So anything way less than that, the 15, 15 and lower, is probably what you want to stay around. You want to get pretty close to failure because tissues respond to load. Your tendons like responding to heavy weights. Now, don't go in there and try to hit your 5 rep max every time you squat, Lynn. I know how crazy you get, but just make sure that it's heavy enough that you're feeling the resistance. You want to feel the tug on your bones, tendons, and muscles. Plyometrics are great, but you got to make sure when you're doing jumps, you're not just kind of like softly going through it. You want to wake up and choose violence. Like, they got to be very, very, very explosive. A lot of times people go wrong where they're doing bounds and everything where it's just very soft. The point of it is just being explosive. You want those tendons to need to respond to things, just like your weight training. And you want to go in many directions. All you're doing when you're running is just going forward. You want to do things where you're jumping to the side, because come race day, what if you have to step off of a curb and that's the first time you've gone that direction? Your body may not respond to that favorably. So jump in different directions, do different things, go rotationally, right? You'd hate to get older and have to go reach for something and a back pops out, because it never happens during training. It always happens when you're like drying your hair or something. I've had that happen. Then you want to do supporting body parts. Hips, glutes, low back, those tend to be the biggest things that get really messed up from training. I would say you want to be focusing on those body parts. Quads and hamstrings would be the next layer. And then I would say upper, just to avoid looking frail, because we don't want to look small. We want to look good while we're running this thing too. So just make sure you're training your upper body to match your lower body too. Upper back is sometimes a focus for me with a lot of my clients, because if they're getting really tired, especially people who tend to be on the back of the pack, if they're starting to get tired after 5 hours, you want to really have that strength to just hold yourself up. There's something called the runner's lean, where you see people really coming in. It does happen even in younger athletes where they're coming in and their back gets tired. You want to get that upper back a little bit stronger to support it, but that's depending on the person, individualizing that. And then I said injury risk, but you'll be more durable in general. So when I say it does help, but it's not always reliable, because like someone like Cody, who's lifting 6 days a week, he's not going to get any of the benefits of strength training for injury risk, because he's already past the frailness that people would benefit from. So you should be continuing this literally up to, 6 days before the race. You should be doing your normal strength training, because remember, a lot of those adaptations, people take them away because they're not doing it, but those are the things that benefited you all the way up. So I would be strength training, and I do this, strength train all the way to at least the week before. Any questions on that? Okay, well, welcome to my presentation. That was it. So, yeah. Thank you. I will open up the floor to any questions you guys might have. I kept it as basic as possible, so please.
What about running technique?
That's a great question. I left it out intentionally. No, I want to answer it, though. I left it out intentionally. Everybody runs slightly different. So although there are general principles, I try not to just give general recommendations, because changing someone's gait actually has some pretty bad results. Even if the new technique is better, the change, because of the volume, can cause overuse injuries in new ways that the body hasn't responded to. Some people might benefit from new technique, but I would say you might want to change that before you go into a marathon plan, not during. So a couple concepts that I've talked about is we don't want to overstride. So people, when they go faster, they tend to reach their foot out. And so there's a lot of braking force by going here and jamming into it. I think that tends to be what causes some lower back pain, some knee pain. So just making sure that the foot lands under you is a good general rule. I would say that would probably benefit most people. But where someone lands on the foot, I mean, there's people winning marathons who are the biggest heel strikers ever. So as long as the foot is under you, I would say that's probably the biggest factor I would play. Getting some slight twist, just kind of being more relaxed in the upper body. And then second, that chicken wing look where you see people have their shoulders roll back, that just tends to be a little bit better than slouching. So I would say those are probably the biggest factors where I'd start. Everything else I would probably need more time and more of a look on a person. But yeah, that's probably where I'd start.
So you said that strength training 6 days until the race day, but how should we think about running that week?
Leading up to the race, yeah. Good question. Also left out intentionally because it is very individualized. So talking about, Sid asked, basically what does a taper week leading into the race look like? I find that people tend to remove their interval work way too soon. Like, you need to keep some of that speed work in there. Now, it's small. That might be 2 by 400 Tuesday before the race. Wednesday, you might take a rest day. Thursday might be an easy run for 3 miles. Friday, a rest day. Saturday, a 2-mile easy run, just to make sure you get the neurological adaptations staying around, and then Saturday or Sunday being the race. So I would say, doing some of that speed work that's not too fatiguing, couple of rest days, couple of run days that are 20 to 30 minutes long, just to make sure your body still knows how to do it. But yeah, you want to reduce volume, probably you want to reduce it by like 30 to 50%. Talking about the carb loading we were discussing, reducing your training volume probably increases your muscle glycogen more than over-consuming alone. So by reducing how much muscle glycogen you're using, your body can keep what's there and then put more in. Great question. Yes, Christina?
I think I know the answer, but
Hit me.
in case others don't, gear specifically, like I think people tend to think of shoes as all purpose. As you've seen,
Mhm.
people wearing Hoka's,
Yep.
the Alpha.
Mhm.
But what is your recommendation, one, on where to buy your shoes, what you should be thinking about in terms of how much life you actually get out of a shoe, so when would you recommend replacing it
Yeah.
before the race? All
Yeah, footwear. Yeah, what are my opinions on footwear is Christina's basic question. Oh, thank God, I've been waiting to answer this. So just remember, there will be someone in this race who will pass you who is completely barefoot. Just keep that in mind. That when you're like, oh man, I need this fucking pair of shoes and I'm gonna crush it this race day. And this guy is gonna just pad along and his feet are as black as night on the bottom because he hasn't worn a pair of shoes, I don't know, in 20 years while he runs. So just remember that what you wear matters very little compared to how you train into the race. Now, I do have general recommendations though. What I literally recommend my clients, and I have gone to the store with my client and we have tried on everything. We spent over 2 hours just trying on every pair of shoes till we got it right. What works for me is not going to necessarily work for you. What works for me today isn't necessarily going to work for me next year because my gait might change, right? How I run might change. What my body weight does, how if I built more muscle in a certain part of my body, shifts me forward and back. A higher drop shoe might feel better for somebody because their Achilles just hasn't adapted yet, versus a lower drop shoe feels better for somebody that has knee pain. And that might change as it goes along. So I would say you want to go and find the narrowness is probably the first part, because how tight a shoe is what's going to determine how many blisters you get. You do want a shoe that fits pretty snug, because blisters are caused from socks and shoes rubbing and pulling that top layer of skin off of the second layer of skin. So if your shoe is too loose, too wide, maybe too tight in a certain area, causing it to rub in different areas, that's going to be the biggest factor, how narrow the shoe is. Then second, how high the drop is. So that means how tall the heel is compared to the toe. My training shoe, the shoe that I do most of my miles in, it's a very high drop. and it's very high cushion. That's where I do most of my miles because that just feels good for me. The shoe that I do my speed work and I will do on race day has a nylon plate in it, so the plate itself stores energy with every stride. It basically springs me forward with every step. That's why those Nike Alpha Flies are so expensive. They have a carbon plate in them, but they're also high cushion. The reason we don't train in them often, I've just found some of my clients that changes how they run. Obviously it springs them forward, so their step is a little bit different. That might be fine for 26.2 miles, but if you're doing that all the time for every run, that can cause some pain in the lower extremities that maybe you just want to avoid because your training doesn't always have to be that way. So for me, I do all my speed work in the shoe that I'm going to do my race in because I just want to keep those conditions about the same. That's a lower drop shoe because if I'm being honest, I'll deal with some Achilles pain to hit my race day goal, but you might not have that same trade-off. So talking about when do we replace the shoe, I'm very pragmatic. I'm going to go until that shoe, as long as it wears down evenly, I'm going to go until that shoe no longer serves its purpose rather than having a set distance that I'm going to go. What I do see all too often is people wearing like the Vaporfly, the Alpha Fly X%. They're just walking around in the gym. Those shoes are only designed for 50 to 100 miles because they're a race day shoe. People are only supposed to get 2 to 4 races out of them. They break down very easily, but that's because the high cushion is just absorbing very often. Versus I use the ASICS Gel Nimbus 25. I'm on my 3rd pair. I buy 2 pair at the same time because I really like them. But I've gotten hundreds and hundreds of miles. I'm probably way past the recommended use, but the reason I buy 2 pair at a time, for me, I've just found that buying 2 at the same time, wearing them interchangeably, extends the life of them. It wears them down evenly. I don't know why. I mean, it doesn't really make sense because you would just assume that it would just be double, but it has gone longer. I don't know the science behind it. I don't know the answer. And it just gives me a reason to spend more money on shoes because, we're runners. We all love shoes now. But you want to go as long as your shoe is wearing down evenly. You don't want to go past where you might see sometimes shoes wear on the side here. You're going to want to replace them when you start feeling it changing how you run. Because going back to your question, if it starts changing your gait during your training, it can cause overuse injuries that you're not used to. Cool?
This may be an out of scope for today's session, but what would you change if we were training for a Spartan race like a 10K?
Okay, yeah, no, that's very good. So mainly with that one, you're going to have the same structure of training. So Spartan, I mean, even if you do like a beast, so they have a 13.1, you need to train as if you're doing a full marathon because the volume is required. You're going to be going out there for the amount of time it takes you to do double the work because there's so many obstacles. What people often get wrong is they prioritize too much of the skill work there. You want to make sure that you're going with a lot of strength because you need the strength to do it. So not really much. I would just train for a marathon instead of a half and then you get all the benefits because you need to make sure your upper body's strong enough to carry yourself across those obstacles like the monkey bars. Get your pull-ups really strong. Go very heavy so you have the muscular endurance to go, and then just train for a longer distance because you're going to be out there for longer than you want to use time-based versus distance-based. But I would say be really freaking strong, be really freaking fast, put them together, and you're going to have a good race.
Okay, I have a question. This is probably more about me. But, like, my job can be physically demanding.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm looking at this and I'm like, some days I just can't do that.
Yep.
So how do I train?
Yeah, no, that's a great question.
Like, some days my body's already worn out.
Yeah,
because
wiped.
I've manipulated it and cleaned
Mm-hmm.
all sorts of, like, different mouths. So, like,
Yep.
I don't.
So the question being, I'll just
Yeah,
repeat it back.
How would I, mentally sometimes, probably I'm not strong at running. I'm like, this sucks.
No, it's a phenomenal question.
Yeah.
So repeating it back so I can have it here. Your question is, what happens if at the end of the day I'm just so physically exhausted? What should I do? So there's 2 questions to ask. One, what workout do I need to do that day? So let's say it's an interval day. If I'm so physically tired that I can't perform it at the intensity I need to, the speed, can I just move this to tomorrow? If the answer is yes, then move it to tomorrow. But you can't always just not do anything, which is where the time-based really shines. Like, that's why I love time-based training. Because can you go power walk for an hour? That's a little less mentally exhausting. But you're getting an hour of training, because for you, you might have to walk during the race. But if you can pick up your walk speed, going from a 18-minute mile to a 15-minute mile, that could dramatically reduce the experience of the race, and that would be an advantage. What I would say is, can you move it around? So that sample week, there's nothing magical about that week. That's why I showed you how you mix in those intensities. If you can move that, if let's say you're just so tired today. All right, I'm gonna just do my easy run today and then do my interval tomorrow. And that easy run might not actually be a run, it's just gonna be a walk. That's fine. Maybe you just do it at an incline. For those of you who saw when I was training for Leadville, I go based on RPE and I go by time. Because at an incline, there's no telling what speed I'm gonna be able to do that day. And I was training very hard with my legs, that if my legs were absolutely trashed, sure, I'm just gonna go half a mile slower today. Half a mile, 0.5 miles per hour slower than I did last week, but I'm getting the same stimulus. Does that answer your question? It's not set in stone. There's no perfect plan. What you're trying to do is say, okay, can I achieve this thing today? And then I think going based on RPE and then duration of time, merging those two together. All right, my 5 out of 10 difficulty is much slower than it was last week, but I'm getting the same stimulus, right? Because if my breath changes because it's hard, guess what? That's still getting that same adaptation. It might just be a slower speed. Cool. Any other questions?
Recovery.
I left this out on purpose. Great question. I love it. You're wasting your fucking time in those boots. Just start there. I love those boots so much. They feel so good. But if you had to trade 10 minutes of running for 10 minutes in those boots, you are wasting your time. Biggest factors to recovery: making sure you're doing adequate volume. So if you're doing too much volume and you can never recover, no amount of boots, foam rolling, gun is gonna replace just doing a little bit less with better quality, and that's gonna help you recover faster. Because your body needs time to build the capacity to do that. So if you need to bring it back, my plans with my clients tend to be less rampy and more of we're gonna do this much of training for these 3 weeks, see if you recover well, and then we might add a little bit if you need it. But just more stable tends to help with recovery versus going from like 18, 19, 20, like these big I guess we'll go this way, big ramps heading into your race. That's probably gonna impact your recovery more than just sitting in those boots, all of that. Second, making sure you're eating enough. That's gonna be a big one. The calories are gonna be required for training. Making sure you're not starving yourself throughout the week and then binging on the weekends. That's what I tend to see with people. It's like, okay, I'm training for a marathon. I need to eat perfect Monday through Friday. And then you're so hungry because you didn't eat enough. Now your training suffered because you didn't eat enough. You feel super hungry. Now you perform like shit and you look like shit. And then that throws you into a spiral. So then you overeat on Saturday. So now you're eating enough calories that the fat sticks around, but your performance suffers. That's a spiral. So calories, making sure you're eating enough carbohydrates, making sure you're getting enough electrolytes, enough fluid, and then training volume and intensity need to be right. That's what I would focus on with recovery. Yeah.
Creatine, or you're wasting your time?
Creatine or you're wasting your time. Creatine is still super important for endurance athletes.
Calorie-wise, should you stay the same like you're normally working out, or should you increase it?
You're gonna need to increase it, but it's probably less than what you're expecting. So hunger is gonna be a big factor here. I would say prioritize fruits, vegetables, low-calorie foods, but eat as much of them as you can. Although I did eat like a burger and fries yesterday, this is not an indictment. If you do that because you think, oh, I'm expending all this energy, I assure you, like, you know, going to the restaurant I went to, they have the calories on there. One burger is 1,300 calories. Unless you do like a 6-hour run, you're probably not burning as many as like you would assume. You just need to make sure that you're matching your activity the best you can. So it's slightly higher, not insanely higher the way most people are like, oh, I can reward myself because I had a 6-mile run today. I wouldn't go that route.
I haven't gotten on the creatine wagon yet.
Mm-hmm. It's a great question. So the bloating thing, I would say that probably only occurs for like the first 2 weeks, but the benefits that come along with it, if you can just survive those 2 weeks and you flush it out, you'll be all right. The breaking out is probably more due to, this is why I'm chuckling, more to do to personal hygiene than the creatine itself. So if you can then push yourself harder in a workout and you're sweating more than you're used to, and then you're not showering directly afterward, that's probably causing more acne than the actual supplement itself, which is absolutely the case. You know, I work in a gym, I'm sweating as I'm presenting to you guys, so yeah. Or hormonal. Well, and what I was gonna say is, the next part of it is, you're also 40, so things are, you know, might be changing for some people, and it's not the creatine that are causing those hormonal changes. That could be increased testosterone because you're perimenopausal. Not you, but somebody might be there. But the benefits, I would say, are probably outweigh the bloating, especially since we see a lot of the neurological and psychological benefits from taking like 5 to 10 grams of creatine a day. You're gonna flush it out, drink plenty of water, but eventually all that water goes into your cells. So if you weigh 2 pounds more, but you perform better, like, that's a trade-off I'd take any fucking day. All right, I hope I answered all of your questions. I hope I gave everything you guys were looking for. Thank you guys so much for coming. I had a blast. Appreciate you guys. Thank you.